Welcome. My name is Richard Baldwin, and this is a panel on the IT study of regional value chains in Africa. We are going to have a conversation about one of the great unturned stones in the world of manufacturing, that is the integration of Africa into global value chains. We have with us today a high-level panel to discuss the general issues. And then we're going to see a report on the ITC's research, which has looked at the possibilities, trying to find unturned opportunities of getting African businesses integrated into regional value chains and global value chains. And then after the presentation, we will have some discussion by two remote representatives of African business. And then we'll have some Q&A from you. So please think of questions as you're going. There's a Q&A function. You can send in the questions, and they appear up here on the screen in front of me, and I'll choose a few that we can all talk, and we'll have a bit of a chat among ourselves, and we'll be done at 11:30. The whole thing will take an hour and a half, and I hope you will enjoy it as much as I'm enjoying being here. In person, it's amazing, an in-person meeting. I'm so happy not to be online staring at my own face, although my own face is here too. That's distracting. Anyways, let me introduce my high-level speakers. The first is Pamela Koch-Hamilton, who's the Executive Director of the International Trade Center in Geneva. She is the boss of the organization that has done the research, that's also hosting this, and a newcomer to the ITC, but a long-standing stalwart in the Geneva trade world. And then after that, we're going to go to Albert Muchanga, who's the Commissioner of the African Union's Commissioner for Economic Development of the African Union. Thank you for flying all the way here. And Cohen Doens, who's a local, the DG for International Partnerships from the EU. We're very pleased to have you here. I guess it wasn't a tough commute for you this morning. No, not very really. Okay. So we're going to have 5 minutes from the reflections from the high-level speakers to start with. And if we could start with you, Pamela, please.
These are working. Thank you so much. It's so good to be here. Albert and Koen, fellow panelists, and participants on the other side of the screen. Thank you so much for the opportunity to present this very critical report. It's great to be here today live and in person. Richard, it's great to be on a panel with another paid-up member of the Geneva trade bubble. I'm here today with my two ITC colleagues, Munder and Julia, to showcase something that thrills me as a self-proclaimed true trade geek. As someone who's worked in South-South regional integration for decades, seeing some successes and a lot of failures. We're here to present a sui generis analytical work that ITC has done to help African Union member states develop regional value chains. Value chains that will make the regional integration a success, and we hope and think boost international trade, intra-African trade. And it's not just the usual trade in primary or low value-added commodities. Trade that makes small businesses in Africa more competitive, more inclusive, and more sustainable. As my staff knows, I always like to start with the why. Why do we do what we do? Why is developing regional value chains so important? And how does this analysis help? First, we want to support the ambition of African governments to end centuries of primary commodity dependence and shift colonial patterns of trade. Perhaps a startling, but by no means unique example of this dysfunction is the fact that Egypt imports most of its cocoa from the Netherlands, which imports the very same cocoa from Ghana and Ivory Coast with very little, if no, value addition. And I could say the same about Switzerland. I can tell you there are no cocoa pods or coffee plants anywhere near my house in Geneva. But I can buy some of the best chocolate from African farms at my local boulangerie. I expect that those farmers haven't got their fair share of my Swiss francs. We all know the numbers behind this. African share in world exports barely above 2% and dominated by primary and unprocessed goods. But intra-African trade is a different story. more processed and semi-processed, more diversified, more tech-intensive. Our own research shows that trade between African markets is more SME-focused and better supports women entrepreneurs. This is exactly the sort of trend that the ITC wants to support with this value chain study. Regional value chains mean more value added. More value added means more competitive firms and better livelihoods. Better livelihoods transform economies and societies. This is exactly the sort of dynamic that will make the regional integration movement not just an agreement, but a vehicle to transform Africa relations, first with itself and then with the world, starting with its trade. I hope that this study and the work being done by so many other organizations supporting the ambition of the intra-regional agreement is that it helps to focus minds. I've been a trade negotiator, so I know the problem. We focus so much on thousands of HS tariff codes, and Koons and I were just talking about this. All the minuscule detail in the rules of origin, all the annexes, commas, and shalls versus shoulds, that sometimes you miss the forest for the trees. This study, we hope, will help to highlight those sectors and products where a little extra push will make a big difference. Value chains where more aid for trade support, more tariff opening, better trade facilitation, a stronger push on quality could change the trading dynamic and create sustainable, worthwhile jobs. I don't want to steal any of Munder and Julia's thunder, but let me give you a taste of the great work they've done. We started with a value chain diagnostic to identify high potential sectors based on their own proprietary tools that we've developed over nearly 60 years of supporting developing country MSMEs in trade. We sense checked those findings with consultations within our networks of SMEs, business support organizations, and governments. Again, the results of decades of work as a trusted partner in Africa. Our business surveys alone cover 10,000 businesses across 24 African economies. We came up with 94 candidate value chains across 24 sectors. I know it's a lot, but keep in mind we started with potentially hundreds of candidates across 54 countries. We then narrowed this down to a handful of promising value chains. And I won't spoil the surprise for you. I leave that to Julia. Before I hand the floor back to you, Richard, so that we can hear from Munder and Julia, let me just ask Koen and Albert for the trust and thank them for the trust that both of you have shown in the ITC on behalf of the EU and the AU. This is important work and a great step forward, making the intra-African agreement not just a success, but something bolder. A platform for better trade that resets the economic relationship between Africa, the EU, and the world. Thank you very much.
Thank you. You know, if this was a hall full of people, we would definitely clap now. But there's only 5. I think we should clap. Oh, here we go. Thank you very much. So, Albert, can I ask you to take the podium and share some of your thoughts on the issues?
Thank you very much, moderator. I salute my two colleagues, Pamela and Cohen, and build on what Pamela said. If you look at the cost structure of manufacturing activities in Africa, the highest cost component is intermediate goods. And the reason is very simple. Those intermediate goods are imported from outside Africa. And that makes manufacturing activity in Africa very expensive. And that's one of the reasons why Africa has not been able to increase a share of global trade. At the time of the independence of many African countries, Africa's share of global trade was around 6%. And as earlier indicated by Pamela, now it is hovering around 2.8%. And this is not good for the structural transformation of Africa. This is not good for the economic development of Africa. And it will this regard that a lot of policy concentration has been made on how to really add value to Africa's commodities. We have the African Mining Vision, adopted around 2009 by our heads of state and government. And in the same year, the heads of state and government adopted the action plan for the accelerated industrial development of Africa. 2 years ago, our heads of state and government adopted the African Union Commodity Strategy, focusing on value addition in the 3 critical sectors of mining, agriculture, and energy. Against the background of these policy statements, there have also been studies on how to undertake the mapping of regional and continental value chains. The latest is the one which is going to be unveiled from the International Trade Center with funding from the European Union. Then with the GIZ, as well as in partnership with the UNIDO and the International Trade Center, we are also in the process of undertaking a comprehensive regional and continental value chain mapping exercise. And the private sector is getting interested in this. Under funding from the African Export-Import Bank, the Association of African Automotive Manufacturers decided to undertake a sector-specific value chain mapping exercise to facilitate the development of the automotive sector. And we're going to hear more when the association comes on board. All these are really taking us in one direction. And the direction is to stimulate investment in the manufacturing activities across Africa. And those activities, including agro-processing, should be either intermediate products, so that we bring down the cost of the importation of intermediate goods, or export of final goods. And in the process, we are going to facilitate both structural transformation and export diversification of African economies. For Africa to increase our global share of, the share of global trade, first and foremost, we must increase intra-African trade. And value addition is going to play a critical role. Because already, as indicated by Pamela, when you look at the pattern of intra-African trade, about 42% of intra-African trade is composed of manufactured goods. But when you look at the pattern of Africa's share or Africa's trade with the rest of the world, maybe with the exception of Mauritius, in each of our African countries, the top 5 export products are not manufactured goods. They are raw materials, which means that there's very limited value addition, and hence the need for transformation. And at the level of research, at our level, we've also started the process of sensitization on the issue of value addition or development of manufacturing activities across Africa. Our recent report, the 2022 Africa Development Dynamics Report, has a component on the issue of value chain development across Africa. So it's an idea whose time has come. And I indicate by saying that when Africa started producing and exporting raw materials, at that stage, it was regarded as an innovation because it created opportunities for creating additional market space where Africa was exporting commodities and importing finished goods. That innovation has reached its course. Now we need new innovation, which is really value addition. And of course, at the back of this, two critical issues are important. One is for Africa to start investing in research and development as benchmarks for innovation, as benchmarks for branding and other sources of value. And the final one is to really build the Made in Africa standard by coming up with a Pan-African quality infrastructure program so that we harmonize rules and standards across Africa, and there we shall be better positioned. With these remarks, I'm ready to listen to the insights developed from the study, and once again, thank you ITC and EU for financing and taking out this study, or carrying out this study. I end here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. Very nice. So I turn now to Commissioner Doans, DG of the International Partnerships. Please.
Thank you, and indeed, Director General, not Commissioner. That's.
I gave you a promotion.
Yeah, indeed, you did. But
not a permanent job.
But I'm quite happy to be the Director General, to be honest. It's no, so really, it's a pleasure to be here with you, with Albert, with Pamela, and because what we're discussing here today, I think, is really important. I mean, like all of us, I think we all in our jobs need to see how we can marry the strategic, the political vision with the real hard work that needs to be done on the ground to operationalize things. And that's certainly a hallmark of my job, and I think for all of us really crucial is it's like the two legs on which you walk. You need political vision and a strategy to really move forward, but you absolutely cannot move forward with that alone. You need to link it to the really nitty-gritty hard work that needs to be done to operationalize certain things. So let me start quickly with the visionary part of it. I think Commissioner Mushanga has just set it out. In the African Union, there is a very clear vision on where they need to go. Pamela and Albert have set out the basic features of it, the underlying figures, data, trends that define it, the absolute need to build manufacturing capacity, to build value addition in the African economies. There is absolutely no reason why that should not be possible. And I think this vision is very strongly carried by the African Union Commission. It's very strongly carried by the African Union, and it is set out very clearly. On the EU side, we have just adopted a new strategy as well, the Global Gateway, which my President von der Leyen is really using as the hallmark of the EU's engagement with the rest of the world, connecting us with various parts of the globe precisely to drive together that kind of agenda that is needed to address the big global challenges, whether it's on energy, whether it's on digital, whether it's on trade, whether it's on manufacturing, and so on. And I think that if you bring these two strategic visions, the one of the African Union and the Global Gateway vision of the European Union, together, you see how the elements for a strong, renewed, new partnership are there. And this is definitely what we hope will be discussed in 2 days' time at the EU-AU summit. The potential that Africa has when it comes to value addition is huge. It is the potential it has to unlock its huge potential in energy, the potential you already see when it comes to digital transformation, but also to a whole series of value chains, whether in agriculture or in textiles or in automotive. I mean, the potential is there to be unlocked. But that requires really hard, nitty-gritty work. And there I'm extremely pleased that we've been able to support the African Union Commission and to support the ITC, to work with the ITC on this study that has been done. I think it's a very nice process, a very nice setup, working basically with the technical experts, the policy technicians, combined with the private sector, looking at what happens already on the ground, not starting from a white piece of paper, but looking at where real potential for these value chain integration exists, and then looking at the obstacles, the opportunities, and how you can expand it. And I think that the study is a first step, a very important step, and I'm sure you will share my enthusiasm once you've heard the details of it. But for me, it's also only a first step, and I'd be extremely keen to continue working with ITC, with you, Pamela, and your people, and with Albert and the African Union Commission to already start preparing the next phase of it. I think the study shows the real potential of development of regional and continental value chains in Africa, and therefore it is only a first step in the right direction. Very keen, very pleased to be here with you, and keen to continue our good work. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Yeah, on the one hand, the commissioner is a higher job, but it doesn't get to keep it forever, right? There we go. It's a mixed blessing. Thank you very much for that. I think that really set the scene, the high level of how important this study is, the potential it has to be not just one more report, but also potentially to unleash an avalanche of private sector involvement, getting African businesses connecting the pieces, helping each other create value chains, things that potentially individual private sector companies and even governments don't have the right incentives. But operating at the level of the continent may make sense. And I think, Pamela, you said to me that once this starts working, you know those big guys are going to jump in there and do it. But let's get it started. Now, we have with us here in the studio one of the key authors of the report, Julia Segerman, who is going to give us a presentation. It's going to be a hybrid presentation. Julia is here in the studio, and Ursula Hermelink is in Geneva online. And we're going to start with Julia. So please, why don't you present the report?
Thank you very much, Richard. Could I have the slides, please? So before going into the slides and starting with all the nitty-gritty, let me first thank the DG for International Partnerships for having mandated us to do this work, the African Union and all the other partners and stakeholders that we have consulted during this value chain diagnostic, and especially the hundreds of businesses who have responded to our surveys and call for feedback across the continent. So thank you very much. Without all of you, this would not have been possible. So let's get started with the nitty-gritty. Let me first give you a little bit of a context for our study. So the COVID-19 pandemic and the resulting economic downturn have very clearly shown us that the business as usual is not the way forward. As the previous speakers have highlighted, currently we see that inputs into essential supplies are available on the African continent. However, the transformation often takes place elsewhere. We need, for a resilient African economy, to resist to external shocks, to strengthen the value chains on the continent. And COVID-19 has very clearly shown that in the field of pharmaceuticals and others. Now, on the exciting side, we of course have now a single market connecting 1.3 billion consumers across 54 signatory countries, which gives us an unprecedented opportunity, and there is also a political will to strengthen the regional integration. In this context where things are moving forward at the moment and we have a momentum, value chains with high value addition, combining countries in different regions, can become key drivers for economic recovery, resilience and integration on the African continent, and help move forwards towards more value-added trade and a more diversified export basket for the continent. But where should governments and businesses channel their investment and efforts? This is exactly the question that our diagnostic aims to answer. So in a first step, we tried to find out which continental value chains are the most promising for Africa. So in which ones are feasible given current comparative advantage and at the same time have high value addition and link different countries and regions across the continent, and which ones also have the highest potential impact in terms of creating jobs, participation of SMEs or other economic, strategic and sustainability considerations. And then in the second part, we try to understand what is needed to make these value chains work. So why is the potential that clearly exists not fully exploited yet? Which investments are needed? And what are the key recommendations to decision makers at a national and Pan-African level to make regional value chains work? So the objective of our work is to create an evidence base to determine priorities for change and to identify a ground for common projects to contribute to a resilient, sustainable economy in Africa. What is innovative about this study? Of course, there have already been several studies looking at value chains in Africa, and we have built upon this very rich existing work that has been conducted by the African Union, UNECA, UNIDO, the OECD, and many other institutions. We have also engaged in consultations with them leading up to this work to ensure that there are really synergies with what already exists and is out there. The two key innovative elements our work is adding is first, a data-driven analysis that combines trade information and input-output analysis to assess which inputs and outputs are already available on the African continent, and based off that, which value chains are already feasible to develop on a continental scale. And then secondly, we conducted extensive consultations with hundreds of businesses in Africa, with sector experts and other stakeholders to find out what is needed to make these value chains work. And I will now walk you very briefly through the process of the diagnostic, and then go into a little bit more detail on the three first steps before handing over to my colleague Ursula for the fourth one, which is maybe the most interesting. So as a first step, we identified feasible value chains in the African continent using an innovative methodology that combines trade data and input-output tables. So these are tables that basically capture the interaction between different sectors of the economy. So, for example, how much inputs from the chemical sector are used in pharmaceutical production. Then secondly, we selected the most promising value chains, and this was done in consultation with the African Union, the EU, and other stakeholders to ensure that we really capture the value chains that are the most promising based on economic and strategic considerations. So going beyond this purely quantitative work, also capturing a more broad view. Then thirdly, we mapped countries into the different value chains and also considered additional data and indicators, including on production, employment, trade and tariffs, etc. And then finally, we conducted interviews with value chain participants across the continent, and also had a web-based consultation to gather feedback to provide evidence on the constraints and investment needs to make these value chains happen. And if any of you who are with us today online have not answered to this consultation yet, it is still up there, www.ntmsurvey.org/Africa. So please submit still your answers. We will still be able to account for them in our analysis. Thank you very much. So let me move to the first and maybe most nitty-gritty step that I will outline to you today. So bear with me for a second. How do we identify these feasible value chains? This is the most technical part. So we first start with 5,000 products that are defined by the Harmonized Systems Classification of International Trade. And for each product, we determine whether it is an input or an output to a value chain. Then we group these inputs and outputs together to identify different value chains. And here we group them together to have 415 value chains that are in principle possible. So sometimes an input is very important for a specific value chain. Let's say you want to make apple juice, you definitely need apples. So it will be a major input which is highlighted by a thick line connecting the input to the output. And sometimes you have minor inputs which are connected with a thin line. Then what we do next is that we find out in which of all these products that are out there, Africa as a whole and at least 5 single African countries have a revealed comparative advantage, meaning that they are really good at exporting this. And so sometimes it can be input, sometimes output, sometimes both in each value chain. So we end up with a couple of value chains where African countries already have a comparative advantage in both inputs and outputs. Then we have some where it's maybe only in the outputs but not in the inputs, or the other way around. And then sometimes there is currently a comparative advantage in neither. So these value chains would not be considered feasible at the moment. Then secondly, we move on to the selection of promising value chains. So for this, we held stakeholder consultations, went back to the literature, and considered additional quantitative indicators to deepen the analysis and identify also additional promising sectors that are maybe not fully feasible as of today, but that hold great promise for the future and are important and can definitely be developed on the continent. Some of the additional criteria we considered included supply and demand considerations, market access, business and strategic considerations, and criteria related to sustainability. And using all these, we selected promising value chains and ended up with 94 promising value chains for Africa in 24 different sectors. Most of them are in processed food and machinery and electricity, but it is really very broad. So many different sectors are represented. Up to 33 African countries can connect to each value chain, so the minimum was 5 that we considered in the study, and then often it is actually more countries that have the capacity to contribute an input or fabricate an output for a value chain. And on average, an African country can connect to 31 of these value chains, given its economic profile. In 73 of these value chains, Africa has enough immediate inputs to actually then transform them into outputs and cater to regional and international consumers in these outputs, and even exceed, for example, what would be the pure regional demand for the whole of Africa. And this is just the opportunities that already exist today. So with the necessary support, they could grow actually much further. Our data is always just the data that is a little bit from the past. So, of course, in the future, things can grow and are probably already growing. So then, thirdly, we map countries into the value chains. And for this, I will show you 2 examples, starting with cars. So motor cars are the 4th most exported product from Africa. And Africa has quite a large export potential of 10 billion to the world, out of which roughly 1/10 is to Africa. It is the sector with the highest potential for intra-African export growth, so this makes it quite promising for intra-African value chains and trade. However, currently there is still a trade deficit in the sector, and we also see that African output providers source 3% of imported inputs from Africa only, so which is of course not very much. On the positive side, we've been seeing a lot of recent investments in the region, and also some things that make this sector particularly strategic is that it can create decent jobs that raise income levels on the continent, and that there is a potential for the use of green technologies. So overall in the sector we see 5 subregions with potential to engage in value chains, and 4 potential output providers and 23 potential input providers, among them 8 LDCs, which is also great news. And then, of course, the inputs, 221 inputs are needed to produce a car. It's, of course, a complex product. We have iron and steel products, engines, motors, etc., you name it. Then secondly, let me move to another example, which is pharmaceuticals. So this sector is a little bit different. Of course, every sector is very different from each other. Here we see at the moment a quite high import dependency of Africa, which really creates the incentive to exploit local capabilities further. So there is a trade deficit. Imports are 16 times as high as exports at the moment. And the current exports of the region would be insufficient to meet regional demand, and the output providers only source 2% of imported inputs from within Africa. So there are definitely large investment opportunities to develop this value chain, and it would really be in the interest of the continent, because this could help build resilience to shocks such as the COVID-19 pandemic, which is of course crucial. In this sector, we have 3 sub-regions that already have the potential to integrate in value chains. We have 7 potential output providers, among them 1 LEC and 2 potential input providers. And of course, there's lots of inputs to this sector, which all come from the chemical and pharmaceutical industries, and I'll spare you the details on those in the interest of time. So to conclude my part of this presentation, we see at the moment unprecedented business opportunities in Africa. Our study has shown that there are 94 promising value chains that include 5 or more African countries. I would like to highlight that if we use a different cutoff, let's say 2 or 3 African countries participating, this number is even much higher. However, these value chains are not fully developed yet. So we have immediate inputs that are available to produce outputs that would serve domestic and foreign consumers in 73 of these value chains. But African producers still source only a small share of their inputs from Africa in many of these value chains. So now the question is, what is needed to make these value chains work? And this is where it comes to the step 4 of the value chain diagnostic, which I will hand over to my colleague Ursula, which is the evidence on constraints and investment needs. So stay tuned for preliminary findings from consultations with entrepreneurs from all over the continent. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Sierman. Let's take a round of applause. Thank you. Now we move straight online to Dr. Ursula Hermelink, who's sitting in Geneva, I guess, at the ICT. Please take over the slides and continue the presentation. We can't wait to hear the results.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me correctly?
Yes.
To check? Perfect. So you have really a gift to elevate people to higher positions. I'm not a doctor. Thank you very much. I would want to start my presentation by taking actually a step back to the theory and remind everybody here of key ingredients for value chain functioning. You're all aware of those, but just as a reminder, for value chains to work, you need information, you need connectivity, you need reliability, you need stability, and for sustainable value chains, you need sustainability. So I want you to keep that in mind while I'm presenting. And I will be focusing, as Julia said, on the factors that prevent businesses currently from fully exploiting the potential that she was talking about, and also Commissioner Muchanga, Pamela, as well as Kuhn. I will be drawing principally on 2 resources there. One are our NTM business service in Africa that have interviewed nearly 10,000 exporters and importers, focusing on trade obstacles, including in intra-regional trade. So these looked at all goods sectors. And more specific work that has started only in December, so very recently, in the framework of this particular value chain diagnostics. It's consultative survey work as well that focuses on 4 priority value chains. Julia has mentioned automotive, she has mentioned pharmaceuticals. We also look into baby food and apparel of cotton. Now for this particular work, maybe just a few more insights. It spans across Africa. So we have gotten feedback from most countries today. The work is ongoing. So if you're from one of the areas that are not shaded in blue yet, get in touch with us. We want to talk to you. So the consultative and survey work includes expert-led interviews with businesses across the 4 pilot value chains, with business support organizations, but also the web-based consultation that my colleague mentioned. And again, the link is here for those who have not yet responded, and I will ask my colleagues to also post it in the chat. As I said, the work is ongoing, so we would want to hear more from businesses in the coming weeks. There's many things I can say, particularly about the businesses participating in the 4 priority value chains, but I choose to focus only on 2 messages for the sake of this presentation. One is on the focus of their business, let's say. Is it national? Is it international? And there's an interesting number. Only 7% of total sales from the interviewed businesses are generated from exports to other countries in Africa. So either, and there's obviously differences between the 4 sectors that you can see here, but mostly companies are focused on domestic markets. And if they export, in most cases, pharmaceuticals being an exception, but in most cases, it is beyond the continent and not to Africa. The second ingredient about the businesses or the characteristics I wanted to share is about trade agreements. To start with, the optimism in terms of benefits arising from a continental trade agreement. And in general, businesses are more or less optimistic. 2/3 think there will be benefits arising to their businesses in those four value chains. About 1/3 are not so sure or not so sure yet, and I will come to why that is. So you may say, so far so good. What we did not expect, though, is the answer to that question. Now, when we are asking, are you actually aware of that such an agreement already exists? Now, this we didn't expect. That 1 in 2 companies actually didn't. So I put a quote here of some of our respondents. First time I hear about it. And we have also asked, for example, to what extent businesses have been consulted preceding AfCFTA on the current negotiations as well. And you see the very low share here among the value chain participants that we talked to. But back to the key question that I am supposed to answer: what prevents businesses from exploiting the value chain potential? Remember the key ingredients in the beginning? Now, first element of the answer is lacking information. Businesses don't know each other. So this is something that what we're hearing a lot. I don't know any African company which supplies the inputs we would need. Now, Commissioner Mochanga has mentioned, yes, sometimes the transformation, the inputs may not be there to the scale that is needed, but inputs are there. Julia has shown that. But businesses don't know them. They don't dare to look for it. Same here is about textile, for example, saying we don't know anybody who supplies fabrics, although they are there in Africa. But also some businesses saying there's insufficient national exhibitions and trade fairs where suppliers would come so we can connect. So suppliers and output producers, let's say, do not often know each other. But that's not the full story, of course. They do not necessarily look for each other either. And why is that? Well, the key challenges reported, again, remember what I said in the beginning, are linked to various aspects. High transport and logistics costs, talking about connectivity, right? There is issues related to reliability, on quality and conformity assessment, on payment systems and access to finance, also into research and development. There's issues of reliability in terms of the implementation of existing agreements and border clearance processes. There's issues related to stability as well of the regulatory framework, with regulations frequently changing, and also unpredictable times and cost in terms of the processes, the administrative processes that govern those regulations. And obviously there's environmental challenges, and all of that, in addition to other factors such as, for example, high cost of utilities, influence the competitiveness of production and obviously the prices as well. And I can't put it better than businesses. So I will quote a lot what businesses say. So here you have a brilliant summary of the dilemma of transport costs, let's say, and uncompetitive prices. A company saying shipping inputs from Africa is as expensive as shipping inputs from China, yet the price of inputs is lower in Asia. So that shows that geographical proximity at the moment cannot compensate for higher cost of production. There's 2 more illustrations I would want to give about the key challenges I just mentioned earlier. One about the insufficient implementation of existing agreements. Here, a very common quote from what we hear in companies, stating that, yes, there are already agreements, regional agreements, bilateral agreements, mutual recognition agreements that exist on paper, but they're not always implemented in the way that they should or could be, which partly probably explains this graph here. And you see the high incidence of yellow on gray, meaning that when businesses are asked about the impact of existing trade agreements, many see none, or are not sure, or are not aware that they had any. Now, those of you with a very good memory, you may remember my earlier slide saying, well, wait a minute, only 7% have sales generated from exports, so maybe this is why they don't see an impact of trade agreements. Yes, but this is only part of the story, because many companies don't export, but they do import from either the continent or beyond the continent. So this can't fully explain why they're not aware of any impact or don't see any impact of existing trade agreements. The second challenge I would want to go a bit deeper into is the high incidence of trade obstacles related to non-tariff measures. And there I would want to cite an insight from the 10,000 interviews that we did on trade obstacles. 63% of exporters in Africa are affected by regulatory and procedural trade obstacles. And that is higher than the average for developing countries, which is around 50, just above 50%. So you could say, well, this is trade obstacles in general. This is not specific to intra-African trade. Well, we can look a bit deeper into that and compare the share of trade or the share of exports with the share of trade obstacles and see which markets are more affected than others. So you see here the graph for agriculture. What does it mean? So it means essentially if the gray bar is higher than the blue one, a market is relatively difficult to access. Now, what you see here in agriculture, for Africa, the gray bar is higher than the blue one. Now, here's what you see for manufacturing. So our colleagues from automotive, from pharmaceuticals and baby food and textiles may have a close look at that. It is massive. And our EU colleagues may have a look at this part on the right. It is not as much as you would have expected. So what do we take away from there? Disproportionately many trade obstacles are reported with respect to intra-regional trade, particularly in manufacturing. Going deeper into what types of measures are problematic, talking first about measures imposed by partner countries in Africa, again looking at intra-regional trade, mostly they are linked to, I mentioned it before, quality, SPS and TBT, so product requirements and the related conformity assessment requirements, testing, certification, etc., but also rules of origin, not to underestimate. Now you may say, well, this was to be expected. Tell me something I don't know. Well, I will try to do that now. Those obstacles make up only 44% of problems in intra-African trade. So what's the rest? These are measures that don't get as much attention as they probably should be. These are export-related measures that are imposed by the exporting country on exporters. Taxes, permits, licensing requirements, quotas, etc., etc. So to also have a look at that, because the trade agreements usually look at those aspects here, not necessarily at the export-related measures within countries. So to finish my presentation, I would want to go deeper into some of the specificities, because what I showed so far is really general insights that cut across sectors. Now, there's many specificities, of course, for different types of companies, women-led, men-led, small, large, medium-sized, etc. For different countries, of course, Morocco is very different from Zambia, for example. Cote d'Ivoire is very different from Mauritius. And obviously also for sectors. And talking about automotives, just to give you an idea of a feeling of the specificities there, what we hear there a lot is the limited institutional infrastructure to certify against complex origin and quality criteria. This leads to some companies actually having to get the certifications in Spain, Thailand, but they can't get it on the continent itself. We also heard a lot about forward-looking. What will the market look like in 10 years? Talking about more low-emission vehicles, for example, and businesses feel there's limited readiness to face that trend. And here we have a producer of electric vehicles in Africa telling us, well, we are actually also supplying the charging stations because at the moment they're not really to be found in the country that we are operating in. Turning to our pharmaceuticals, the specificity there is that we hear about strong formal competition with suppliers in Asia and strong informal competition at the same time from the counterfeit and expired drug markets. That represents a big problem. Again, I have a quote here from a company to illustrate that. But also, and that was quite surprising because it didn't get much attention yet in existing strategies in pharmaceuticals in Africa, is the waste management system. Waste management and water management system. What to do with contaminated water from production, what to do with expired drugs, where to dispose of them without harming the environment or human health is a big issue and is a big question of investment as well on the continent. So now what? Now we have challenges, what to do about them. Now I don't have that much time to elaborate on that. it would need elaboration. So as a business puts it here, it's not about one thing that needs to change. It's actually the creation of a whole ecosystem that we need to have, and everything else will follow. So if you want to be super simple, go back to the first slide and say what you need is ensure that businesses have information, connectivity, reliability, stability, and the sustainability, right? Now, this is very superficial, of course. Now, if you want more specifics, we propose some draft recommendations that come from the private sector, industry experts in the document that is, I think, below the screen on the events page, on the session page of the EABF platform. If I had to pick just one, my favorite recommendation, I would actually go with what Commissioner Muchanga had said. Let's start believing in our own product, build trust made in Africa, and invest in a continental quality and conformity assessment infrastructure. The elements are there, the push is there, the will is there, and it's absolutely needed when we look at what businesses say. So in conclusion, from both what Julia said and what I say, again, I can't put it better than what businesses want to us. So here's the quote from businesses. Basically, there is potential, but there must be the will to do it. So this is the main takeaway from what we have. For the way forward, just to finish on that, we still want to hear your views. So do respond to the web-based consultation. So the link is here and it will be in the chat. Get in touch with us to share insights, feedback, comments also on the document that we posted on the page, and also for more in-depth interviews. And also stay tuned for what is yet to come. So the final results are still to come, plus the entire follow-up. DG Kuhn was mentioning it earlier. There will be more going forward. And with this, again, I would want to join my colleague Julia in thanking you, specifically all the survey respondents and also our national sector experts across the continent. We have an entire army doing interviews, giving us insights. I know some of you are here. A big, big, big thanks from us. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much, Ursula. Thank you very much for that. Now, we should be joined online by two representatives of the African business community, one from Cairo and one from Lukasha, but I don't see, here we go. All right, we got Cairo online, Ahmed Fikir Waheb. All right, and Sandra Uwira, here we are online. The technology works perfectly. I'm amazed, I must say. So thank you very much for joining us. At least there's not a big time zone difference between Africa and in the EU, so it's not desperately early in the morning or late at night for you. What I'd like to do is get your reactions to both the sort of contextual high-level introduction, but in particular to the ICT's report, some of the points they've made. This was a report was very carefully tried to keep as close to the coalface as possible, but you are actually there, and would be great to get your perspective on it. Now, if you will, I'll start with Ahmed Fikir Al-Awab, Managing Director of the Egypt-German Auto and Vice President of African Auto Manufacturers. So I guess what we could start with you is to ask what you thought about the potential of auto. Auto was signaled out as one of the great potential things, and it is also one of the industries in which global value chains work very well all over the world, and I think this is one of the things when people think of global value chains, they think about cars. So what aspects of the report that you heard are particularly affecting the auto, or what do you think of the auto sector's participation in this kind of construction?
Well, good morning to all of you. It's a pleasure to be with you on this panel. Thank you very much to the ITC. I have to say I am very pleased with what I've heard from the diagnosis and the results of the study that was presented by Julia and Ursula. And I would also like to reiterate, before I start, what His Excellency, the Commissioner Muchanga, has talked about, and that is building trust in Made in Africa. That's a very important starting point. The diagnosis is very clear. I'm going to take some things and dwell on them a little bit, and I will try to make it as brief as I can, because there are lots of issues that are worth discussing, and actually this can take a good couple of hours to go through them, but I will try to be as brief as I can be. To start with, a key element in the development of value chain is trade across borders. This is an issue that we have been battling with on the African continent in general, and we need to, the governments in Africa need to work with the private sector and find out ways to smooth the movement of goods in and out of the different countries. His Excellency alluded to the intermediate goods part, which is a very important part of the value chain. We get products coming from different parts of the world, be it from Africa or elsewhere. They stop in customs, and I'm talking about generally, I'm not talking about one particular country, but generally this is a situation in Africa. They stop in customs for quite some time. In many cases, things related to technicalities, to securities, and let's face it, in many African countries, custom duties still represent a big chunk of the finance of the government, and hence customs barriers and the tariffs that are paid is an integral part of this. And so going back to the issue of trade agreements, which go for a zero tariff between the countries, in many cases there are question marks about the rules of origin. Now, this puts us in a loop, one, getting the rules of origin agreed upon, and then once they are agreed upon, them being honored and respected is another issue that is very important to acknowledge. So this issue of rules of origin is a very important part, the definition, the technicalities, and the standards. And I would like to recommend that we take a very close look at the UNECE set of regulations when it comes to the automotive. This is an effort that has been going on since 1958. A lot of work has been done in it, and it calls for harmonization and mutual recognition between the different countries. And so I would like that we don't start in Africa to recreate or to reinvent the wheel. Let's work on what is available out there and use this to advance. Does automotive have potential? I'm very bullish. I work in this field, and I've been working in this field for many, many years. And let me just say why I think that this field of automotive is extremely important. It allows for development both vertically and horizontally. Vertically, you have a big spectrum of skill levels, which can cover from literally low skills to very, very high skills. So if you engage or integrate in the value chain, you benefit from being part of, you being the country, become part of the value chain globally. So going from wiring harnesses to very sophisticated embedded software systems and artificial intelligence are becoming now part of the discussion of autonomous driving and what have you. So that's the depth. The width, or the horizontal axis, is the number of industries that it covers. And I'm talking now from a manufacturing point of view. Literally, just about any industry one can think of, leather and tanning, textiles, rubber, you name it, you will find that the automobile covers it. Now, what is happening in Africa is we're seeing high levels of GDP growth, which will mean that you will have a population that has the means to buy its own cars. And this population will be going from 1 million plus vehicles to 5 million plus vehicles in the next 5-7 years or so. Where will the vehicles come from? If we don't do a lot of effort, these vehicles are going to come from the rest of the world. We'd like to see a big chunk of these vehicles coming from Africa. And if it's not coming from Africa, at least there is a high level of integration of the value chain between the different African countries. So what I would like to see is we need to develop the Auto Pact for the African nations. We need to agree on rules of origin for this industry. And probably what will happen is we will see big hubs for assembly, but actually the bigger chunk of work and business is in the feeding industries, because the factories that produce 200,000 or 300,000 vehicles employ 5,000 or 6,000 people, while the feeding industries have a multiplier effect of 6 or 7 times that number to serve them. So there will be countries that will have hubs of assembly, but there needs to be integration. Now, this lack of dissemination of information, I have to say, is an issue which has been alluded to. I'll give a couple of examples. One is the African Continental Free Trade Agreement and knowledge of it and how it's proceeding. But there are others. The AfCFTA Bank has a program of 1 billion, a dedicated program of $1 billion US. The program is called the AfCFTA Bank African Automotive Support Facility. It facilitates finance for exports between African nations and beyond. And when I talk to colleagues, very few know about it. So we need to make sure that such information is disseminated in the community. I would like to stop here. There are lots of other things that one can talk about, but I would like to stop here and allow or give some time to my colleague Sandra and for questions, and I would be more than happy to intervene when my turn comes back again. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ahmad. So let me just, before we move on, let me just ask you 2 very specific questions. The first one is, I want to thank you. If we could go back to Ahmed, please. Thank you very much. I thank you for pointing out the demographic boom in Africa. And it's not just for cars. All sorts of things, if it works right, this emerging middle class in Africa will buy an enormous number of manufactured goods, and when many markets in the world are shrinking or not growing as fast. So I think that's really a key point you made. The second is I wanted to ask you how important are tariff preferences in the establishment of these global value chains. You talked about rules of origin, but are tariff preferences top of mind for you?
Yes, that's a very sticky issue. And those who are developed like to drop the tariffs on the other side. And I'll talk about many African nations that have signed free trade agreements, find that it becomes very difficult to compete when the tariff is zero. However, if we want to establish strong value chains within regional value chains within Africa, there has to be not only a drop of tariff, but also accumulation of origin. We need to think of a situation where eventually we talk about the AU vis-a-vis EU in a free trade agreement, while we manufacture, let's say, wiring harnesses in Morocco, then we get from Kenya tires, assemble the vehicles in Tunisia, and then ship this product where the origin of Morocco and Kenya and Tunisia becomes one African origin. And if that becomes the case, this will allow for a free flow of products between the African nations and develop the value chain in a much, much better way.
Thank you very much for that. Just by way of history, when the wall fell and the European Union signed free trade agreements with many of the Central and Eastern European countries, originally there was no accumulation in those agreements, and it rapidly led to accumulation, which had a big impact on the trade. So we have it's a practical thing to do. Thank you so much for that. If we could move on to Sandra Uria, who is the board secretary of COMESA Business Council. And I'm very interested in hearing your experience. We see you on the screen. It's coming back. Here we go. Hello, Sandra. There we go. Thank you very much for being with us. You're sitting in Lusaka, as I understand. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Very good. Very good.
I am in Lusaka, Zambia. Yeah.
Perfect. Thank you. So what I'd like to ask you a question, and this is really just a leading question, so you can say whatever you really want to share, what you wanted to reflect. That is, what are the challenges reflecting industries, the real challenges, with perhaps more of an emphasis on pharmaceuticals and agro-industry than the autos, as we've already heard about that? Please.
Okay. Thank you, and it's a pleasure to be on this panel and have this very, very insightful discussion on how to, build our value chains in Africa, especially in this critical time. I'm glad that you highlighted that, because the role of my discussions today is primarily to highlight some of the ground challenges and recommendations from the private sector that we represent as a COMESA Business Council. Specifically, we'll be highlighting the interests of 2 out of 11 business sector work groups, namely the Pharma Healthcare work group and the agro-industry work group. So just to give you a snapshot about who we are as a COMESA Business Council, we're a regional business member organization that is recognized as the apex body of the private sector in COMESA. We are one of the leading BMOs in Africa. We present about 34 business sectors across 21 markets, and we promote competitive and interconnected industries to actively participate in influencing policy and also engaging in trade promotion, business facilitation, and enterprise development within COMESA and also the larger Africa. So over the past couple of years, we've been closely working with the Pharma Healthcare work group and the agro-industry sector. And it's important to note that these key sectors are very imperative in terms of promoting agro-industry, promoting pharmaceutical strength and competitiveness in the region. Allow me to just focus first on the pharmaceutical sector. So pharmaceutical production in COMESA is very imperative to guarantee affordable challenges, affordable access to public health drugs and commodities, especially now as we see challenges of supply of drugs within our continent. I think that's one of the key issues that the COVID-19 pandemic has highlighted to us. And there's a huge, huge opportunity here for COMESA to industrialize and join global value chains. We've seen that local production of pharmaceuticals can advance industrial development. It can reduce external dependency. It can also facilitate stronger regulatory oversight to curtail counterfeit products within our market. It can also improve the balance of payments through savings on foreign exchange and also create jobs across the African market. So some member states, like Egypt, have some very strong form of pharmaceutical production. Yet there are various member states and companies that vary in product quality and the ability of the regulatory authorities to enforce these standards. So we've seen that manufacturers largely rely on imports of most of the inputs, as has been highlighted by the study. Ursula has greatly emphasized on that. And I would also like to just bring to the fore some of the key issues that really are being discussed by the private sector within our pharmaceutical work group in this sphere. So one of the key issues is poor regulatory environment, and there's a poor policy review and harmonization. So the pharmaceutical sector has actually called the CBC to strengthen requirements for product registration for each country because they're very complex, and there's a lack of harmonization and standardization of the national medical regulatory authorities in this regard. There are very many complex legal frameworks. There are unclear definitions of the responsibilities and regulatory gaps and overlaps. And some national medical regulation authorities, NMRAs, are not fully established in some of these countries, and they're not performing all the regulatory functions. This directly affects the performance of pharmaceutical manufacturers within the domestic territories and also those who are looking to go into cross-border markets. We also have a challenge of very strong, stringent government control. The health and pharmaceutical industry remains highly controlled through subsidies, distribution restrictions, import and export restrictions, which distort the market and affect investment in the sector. We've also had big challenges, especially now in trade facilitation, where we've seen delays caused by COVID-19 screening, testing procedures, too much documentation that's needed, and a lack of one-stop borders posts for some of the commercial goods. Then largely, the cost of production in Africa is very, very high. African manufacturers have suffered several cost disadvantages, including high unit costs associated with manufacturing. They've also had challenges in terms of accessing materials and machinery, and also accessing finance for utility services. And then we also have a very small scale of sub-Saharan producers in very fragmented markets, and there's need to actually bring them together as consortia to work towards building similar standardized products for larger markets. We've also seen the challenge of market access, which has also been highlighted in the study. And this has really affected local production in our markets. It is low and it is continuously declining in COMESA. Existing supply systems often favor imports, as taxes and tariffs are often charged on inputs to pharmaceutical production. And so there's not enough importation of finished goods, from our market. So that's also a big challenge that we're also having. So the pharmaceutical industry work group has highlighted the need to upgrade the value chain itself. And I'm glad that ITC has emphasized that quite a bit. We have countries, there are very many countries who would consider upgrading the value chain beyond just manufacturers. Many countries in Africa have a highly fragmented landscape of distributors, wholesalers, and retailers. And all of these could add value into the individual markups to the product. We've also called for very strong regulatory reform and attention that has the influence of the private sector. So the business community is proposing for the establishment of a medicine and pharmaceutical healthcare committee at the African and COMESA level to improve regulation of medicines and medical products and technologies, and especially with a keen focus on looking at the regulatory system and a focus on the registration and inspection procedures of drugs. Also, we are looking at strengthening investment in technologies with a key focus on drug product formulation. We need strong R&D centers set up in Africa to promote this. We need to focus a lot more on standards and quality of our pharmaceutical drugs in Africa. We need to strengthen sufficient production, manufacturing, by building plants within Africa. I'm happy to see that South Africa is doing quite a bit in that. Egypt has also put in a pledge to set up a COVID vaccine center, so has Rwanda. So we can see a lot of countries coming in this particular nature. And also strengthening regional hub creation to include smaller countries to participate in building more globally competitive industry clusters. With these regional industry clusters, we have a better chance of improving our value chains, producing more affordable, high-quality drugs than if the efforts are fragmented or dissipated across large numbers of subscale investments across our continent. On the agro-industry sector, a lot has been highlighted within the study, but as we all know, agriculture contributes about 40% of GDP within the COMESA region, and approximately it boosts about 70% of our population in COMESA. And COMESA has a population of about 582 million consumers. So you can imagine that a lot of them are actually driven by the agro-industry sector. And in this case, when I talk about agro-processing industry, we keenly focus as the CBC on the vegetable oil, fruits and vegetable processing, beverages, dairy, nuts, forestry and plantation products, fisheries, grain milling, among others. So many of the African enterprises in this sector have highlighted obstacles to complying with standards in the agro-industry sector. These challenges include lengthy and burdensome processes to obtaining certifications, including product testing, labeling, and other requirements, which has been highlighted in the study as well. Lack of test and controlling facilities that are available to micro, small, and medium enterprises that primarily drive the agro-industry sector. And also the lack of technical capacity building and trained personnel to drive quality African products within agro-industry. And there's also an unusually high payment of a certification process when it comes to trying to comply to standard certification conformity assessments within Africa. So there's need to strengthen access to finance for SMEs to actually be able to get certified within our markets. So one of the things we have tried to do as a business council through our program called Local Sourcing for Partnership, we've tried to provide minimal training requirements on to micro, small, and medium enterprises in HACCP, the HACCP standard, the Hazard Analysis and Critical Control Point Standard Certification. We've tried to link SMEs to bureaus of standards at a national level and also link them to markets. But there's a lot more that needs to be done within this particular dynamic. And first and foremost, we need to really put together a very affordable base for SMEs to be able to get certified, to access markets, to get engaged in trade beyond their very critical domestic territories. So some of the key recommendations we're putting in this particular regard is providing investments for incentives for investments in high-value processing for agricultural products, promoting that can look at promoting local manufacturing of agro-processing machineries and equipment, and also encouraging clustering of industries. I cannot emphasize this more. To strengthen the linkages, we also need to strengthen linkages between agriculture and industry across our markets. We need to bring in the aspects of digital transformation and digital technology to improve the operations, the business operations of SMEs, to help them to have more value-added products that are moving within our local markets. I have talked about standards, and I would still like to reemphasize that standards and certifications are one of the biggest market access challenges that SMEs are facing in the agriculture sector, and there needs to be more effort in boosting this particular capacity. And it's also important to note that within Africa, we have a very sophisticated consumer, a very sophisticated consumer that has a preference for high quality products. And this is the same as the global market. So it's very important that the quality African product that we're talking about here is guided by very clear standards and methodologies. And I'm glad to see that the ITC standard study has talked about working very closely with ARSO, the Africa Regional Standards Organization, to improve standards harmonization across our markets. This is very important for micro, small, and medium enterprises in Africa, very important for manufacturing capacity and productive capacity, and it will definitely also help us to address aspects in terms of reducing the costs of certification for SMEs, which are very high right now, and they actually act as a deterrent for SME growth and sustainability in the sector. So I just want to highlight those few points, and I look forward to questions that might come my way. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sandra. Let me immediately just ask before we go to Q&A, and let me remind the audience that if you have questions for any of the panelists or general questions about the report, please send them in through the Q&A function. But Sandra, now you mentioned in passing COVID-19, and I guess it's the topic of the day, so we have to talk about it a little bit more. And in some sense, there's a big push on vaccines coming from COVID in Africa. Mm-hmm. And I wondered if you couldn't think of this as a kind of a spark or a trigger of an avalanche that might go further. Do you have any reflections on whether COVID-19, as terrible it is, might be an opportunity for pharmaceutical industry in Africa?
Absolutely. I must say that over the past 7 years, we've been trying to highlight the challenges of the pharmaceutical and healthcare industry in Africa and bring them to the fore, especially in terms of promoting the local registration of drugs and the movement of public health drugs across our markets. This subject matter wasn't very welcome, in very many political circles, given the dynamics within the pharmaceutical industry. But after COVID-19, it became a very timely subject. I have seen players across the various markets coming together and even discussing how they can set up regional manufacturing plants, across countries to boost the development of the COVID-19 vaccine and other public health drugs within Africa. We've seen businesses, international businesses, coming and setting up shop and looking at going to joint venture partnerships with local manufacturers and even R&D labs within Africa to boost the same dynamics. So I do believe over the past 3 years, there's a lot of interest within the sector. We're even working closely with our counterparts in the US through the Corporate Council on Africa on engaging on pharma healthcare industry. and seeing how to strengthen the efforts within Africa. So there's a lot, but the key challenges still remain in terms of addressing the regulatory process, the distribution channel processes. We need to strengthen our supply chain systems within Africa to accommodate movement of these drugs. And also we need a very strong political will from governments to ensure that we have these local manufacturing hubs set up and operationalized. And also we need to ensure that we're selling affordable drugs within Africa, because that would also be a big challenge for our consumer market, which is currently the issue right now. So I do hope that the political will is moving towards that direction in terms of boosting intra-trade in pharma healthcare.
Thank you very much for that, Sandra. So there actually are no questions coming in from the audience. I don't, or maybe of technical function, but anyways, I have lots of questions. And what I would like to do, if I may, is actually turn to Ambassador Machonga. There was often a discussion of some political will issues, both by Ahmed and Sandra. And of course, you are the commissioner for economic development for the African Union. Could you address that, or maybe ask them questions about what needs to be done? Where is the political will coming from?
Thank you very much. Can we hear them? Yes. Okay. But before I address the question, Dr. Ursula Hermelink raised a very important figure in her survey, where there was an indication that a lot of businesses, African businesses, do not know about market opportunities in Africa. That's a very, very interesting figure. But the reality is that we throw back the back to the private sector. They do not want to know about market opportunities in Africa. And I've got 3 examples. Before we handed over the African Continental Free Trade Area to the new Secretariat in Accra, Ghana, I traveled across Africa trying to sensitize the business community about the opportunities offered by the African Continental Free Trade Area. 2 things happened. One, there were very few business houses which bothered to attend those town hall meetings. And of the few who were attending, their questions was not about market opportunities in Africa. Their questions were, how do I increase my exports to Europe or the United States of America? They're not interested about Africa. The second one is the Intra-African Trade Fair, which we created with the African Export-Import Bank to build on the All-Africa Trade Fair. Again, we find very little participation by organized African business. There was a difference, and I must commend them. The Association of African Automotive Manufacturers, they had a very, very big pavilion in Durban, which was commendable. But the rest of the private sector has to come on board. And the third example is that in 2018, we created the African Continental Free Trade Area Business Forum to promote business-to-business networking and government-to-business networking. Again, African business let us down. They do not bother to come forward. So the ball is in your court. You need to respond. The political will is there. When the heads of state and government decided to create the African Continental Free Trade Area, it was going to be a universal arrangement at once, in the sense that it was open to all the 55 African Union member states. So far, only one country has not signed on, and eventually is going to sign on. And the 41 countries have ratified the agreement, which means that it's working. That reflects a high level of political will. Now, it's their turn as business. I'd like to see African businesses investing in logistic facilities across Africa so that they can reach every consumer across the continent. I would like the business to make demands that they will need to have a business visa so that they are able to move across Africa. We have created the African Business Council, so there's no excuse to say we don't have a forum. Let us have those demands. We have come up with the Africa Quality Policy, which is going to remove technical barriers to trade, which were highlighted as being impediments to intra-African trade. And out of that, we're going to come up with the Made in Africa standard. If it's weak, tell us. We're going to improve it. The political will is there. The African heads of state and government are ready to work with the African private sector to develop Africa. Now it's your turn to respond. I challenge you. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Ambassador. So we are almost out of time, but this discussion between the change and reminds me of a cartoon where in the top panel, the speaker says, "Who wants change?" and everybody raises their hands. And in the bottom pan, "Who wants to change?" and nobody raises their hand. So, but you have to start from somewhere. And I think, if nothing else, the vaccine movement is an indication that there is potential here. Now, what I want to do is just pass the word back to Pamela, who is the ITC is the sponsor of this. I'd let you make the closing remarks.
Okay, thank you so much. I mean, you asked me to make a closing remark after all of this. You know, where do I start? But let me just use this analogy. I remember when I was negotiating for the Caribbean several years ago, I remember the first thing was, yes, we need a trade agreement and we need, to do free trade areas and that will fix our problem, regional integration and CARICOM and all of that. And it didn't. Then we said, we need access to finance. That's what we need. We need more access to finance. And we got money. It didn't fix our problem. The same is true. We need a strong private sector engagement. If we get strong private sector engagement, what we understand, at least what I understand at this stage, is what we need is all. And we need all at the same time. And the difficulty we have is we keep operating in silos about what needs to be fixed when. What I really, really love about this study is that it operates from an evidence-based perspective. And it outlines very clearly what the value chain assessment is, what's the diagnostic, what are the obstacles, the impediments to getting this done, and where do we go from here. And I think the where do we go from here is the critical aspect of what we need to do, and that's where we'll be going from here. But I just want to really thank the private sector. I want to thank Ambassador Muchanga. I want to thank Koen Dunes. I want to really thank our supporters who have helped the ITC to actually pull this really so generous study together, because I think it can form the basis of how we move forward in a very concrete way, but also in a very coordinated manner. We have evidence, we have recommendations, and we have the will. So together, let's do it.
Thank you very much. And with that, I bring the proceedings to a close. Thank you very much. Oh, I'm sorry. Okay, we're okay.
Rush into the next panel.
Next panel, right. Thank you very much. All well done.